The Buddha used one particular word quite often in connection and as one of the kileshas, which in English we use the word defilements to describe. The word I'm referring to is Moha. Moha. Oftentimes, translators and commentators in the English language have chosen the word delusion to describe what moha means. Most of my life in studying the Dhamma, I've always, and especially practicing the Dhamma, I found this word, the English word delusion, not to sit well, so well with me, to give a fuller extent of what the experience of it would otherwise denote. Again, in connection to lobha, dosa, and in itself, moha. Excuse me. Lobha stands for, of course, greed, the desire to go after mundane things, and the craving, the attachment. And dosa stands for the ill will, the vyapada, or the anger, the hatred, the aversive attitude. But moha and delusion don't necessarily fit together so well. And I've been struggling with this, given the recent events in the world during the past year, I would say, or at least half a year. And the current situation in the world, where there's so many different types of actions being committed in the name of some lofty ideals. And one of the actions that I'm referring to here is the result of toxic neutrality, which I found to fit rather swimmingly into the word moha. And specifically, the word in English, the word carelessness, fits. It's a little bit more active than the word delusion. Delusion, to me at least, it has this sense of it doesn't involve any particular entitlement, any particular position on behalf of the person. It's very passive. One might even be forgiven for having ownership of it as delusion, which can be easily ameliorated, fixed. But carelessness, on the other hand, is quite powerful. It's very active. Just like the other two, lobha and dosa. For some reason, I've always found moha to be, I've even called it several times, the mother of the other two, the progenitor of the other two, of greed and aggression or hatred, anger. But these states do not necessarily come from a state of passive presence. To to my experience, to my understanding, they come from a place of carelessness. At least carelessness towards one's own awakening, one's own efforts that need to be placed in a certain direction. It needs this push, this propulsion, if one is to become an awakened person. With practitioners, I've often found that the mere act of meditating should suffice. The mere act of wanting to uphold or even take the precepts early in the day and reminding oneself of those should suffice. Listening to Dhamma talks should be enough. Going on retreats ever so often should be enough. Sitting for 1 hour or 2, however it is, should be enough. And the rest of the time, meanwhile, the person just lets go of the helm, lets go of the steering wheel of their lives. They're just allowing things to happen. And it's so difficult in those majority parts of the day to bring the mind back to sati, to bring the mind back to wisdom, sati sampajanya. These two have to be there constantly. So the carelessness towards one's own practice becomes such a big deal. It adds this fervency to the whole process. And it's interesting also that the Buddha used so many different terms to describe that propulsion system, if you will, the energy quality, which he called virya or aditana, just to name a few. That determinative energy, that power that needs to be there on the table constantly. It needs to be in the crosshairs, the intention to break free from samsara, the intention to break free from ignorance, and the intention to unshackle oneself from this sense of carelessness towards one's practice, towards where the mind is supposed to be at all times. And because the Dhamma is so engaged in its very DNA, the carelessness seeps into the family. The carelessness seeps into the society. The carelessness seeps into entire governments, entire countries, continents, and the world. And one becomes the holder of the toxic neutrality position even in the face of barbaric violence. And that carelessness now becomes even more sophisticated in the hands of such a well-versed and ideal worshipping characters who can become so disassociated from life that they can even justify the inhumanity that they themselves are showing in the face of savagery. That is the same as if we go back to the Moha that we were addressing earlier. That's it. It's the same thing. It's just now has become so far removed, so far refined rather, And the same intention not to become awakened oneself and finding excuses for that. And we do have plenty of excuses not to want to push and propel ourselves towards awakening. And refuse to heed the words of the Buddha, that each of us must be an island for ourselves and push forward with our own efforts for our own awakening. We refuse to heed that call of his, the last, before he breathed out his last breath. Similarly, many of us are refusing to heed the call of our humanity, as the carelessness now becomes of a wider scope. And society today has refined terms to justify its moha or carelessness. In other words, indifference. Lofty ideals that we are civilized beings, that we should give an opportunity for everyone to have equal say in everything, while we are completely avoiding to look at what's in front of us, what is happening. Just like the individual was refusing or is refusing to look at the constancy or the repeatability of their frequent choices, which end up every single time to bring them down into the hotbed, boiling oil of dukkha. And the only way they can get out of that big pot of burning, boiling oil is determined, directional, intentional action to walk away, crawl out of it. The urgency, which the Buddha called samvega, to seek out one's own salvation. And in the midst of it, and as an extension of it, to be able to help the world to come out of its chaotic state, of its delusion, of its carelessness, of its indifference. So to me, the Dhamma is very engaged, very, very engaged. But not while wearing the gloves, sterilized gloves of theories and concepts and refined language and dissociative behavior towards what is happening in the world, as we sit in our ivory towers, far removed from war zones and where horrific actions are being, enacted on fellow human beings. The Dhamma is very engaged, starting with one's own life by taking charge of one's life, not making excuses when we are careless in our awareness, in our mindfulness, in making it become steady, and therefore we falter and we refuse to make up for it. Put a little bit more energy into it. The Buddha discussed the bojjhangas, the satta bojjhangas, the 7 factors of awakening, in so many beautiful ways. And he calls the bojjhangas, or 7 factors of awakening, as the crucial, critical formula for awakening. These are the tools that, once they are balanced in the mind of the practitioner, in the character, in the behavior, very behavior of the practitioner, they bring about awakening. No qualms about that. No ifs and buts about that. There's sati, which is mindfulness. There's Dhamma Vichaya, which is investigation, careful analysis of the states that one is in. Understanding, which indicates wisdom, the presence of wisdom. Then there's virya, or energy, which fuels. Every time there's a notice that the gas tank is running on empty, it fills it up again with energy. And then comes piti, or the joy factor, that enlivens the practice. When we feel like we're going into a dip, into a ditch in our practice, in the level, the gauge of our mindfulness, when it's dropping, we add that, it's like spices things up, and all of a sudden we're back up again. And then we need to settle those 4, or at least 3 of them. Mindfulness is there hovering. It's always present in all of them. And then there is pasaddhi, which is the tranquility factor. Now we are getting into the domain of samadhi, which is so essential for there to be this restful, calm, gladdened state of mind that permeates into the body. And when it exudes every facet of one's being, then there is the presence of equanimity, or upekkha, the 7th, the final. I've mentioned it many times that it is like a seesaw. When it comes to this sense of equilibrium, then nibbana occurs. But all throughout of it, there is the active involvement of the intentionality of the individual. There is no room for carelessness. Idle, just staying idle. There isn't that anymore. And the engaged Buddhism comes from that, to my understanding, as indicated by the life of the Buddha. The Buddha wasn't a softie. The Buddha wasn't leaning to any of the extremes. He wasn't a leftist. He wasn't a rightist. He was just there, needed to say what needed to be said. When the society was going off track, he would be there to bring it up. When the kings of his time were visiting him, the rulers, the absolute rulers of his time. And he would support decisions and he would not support certain decisions. So he was also engaged in that fashion. However, he did not get... There was a clear demarcation point. There was a clear lining separating the two, of course. So the engagement of oneself in one's practice inevitably eliminates the carelessness that pulls the person back from going all the way, from going towards arahantship. There need not be that delay factor anymore, because we each have our own life to live. And this is the one ticket, this is the one shot we have. There is no delay. There's no room for delay throughout the teachings of the Buddha. So I wanted to offer these thoughts, these points, and for your reflection, and to see how they might fit in your practice, in your development and understanding and expansion of worldviews. As I engaged in mine, as I go through processing, understanding, and pushing the boundaries of my own understanding of worldviews every day that I spent on this planet, using the practice, using the suttas, using the life of the Buddha as my reference guide. So that is what I have to offer at the moment, and I would like to hear your thoughts, questions, comments, critiques. Yes?
Thank you, Bhante.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't quite understand the term toxic neutrality. Is that the same as making everything just relative without taking a moral stand? I wasn't quite. I was not too clear what it means.
That's yes. That's definitely in the ballpark. When the person is abstaining from having a position, concrete position, which basically you're in the safe zone. Because if you say something, then you might be held accountable for at least having a shadow, having a position. People have come to the point where making abstractions, making statements that are not definitive. You know, we've become very political. If you've ever seen a politician answer a crucial question and they're finding their way out, weaseling their way out, slipping like an eel between the fingers. And in fact, that's a term that the Buddha has in the suttas. And he warns individuals, monks, from engaging in any conversation with such characters. He calls them, in English, it's eel wrigglers. So one has to be very careful because from falling into that trap. And there is nothing honorable or moral. And that's another thing. Moral. The word moral or morality has become a taboo in our cultures across the globe. I thought this was a disease that we had or we have in the United States. But in my travels in Australia, New Zealand, Europe, now Eastern Europe, it's everywhere. Where people are afraid of saying, you know, my parents used to have a saying like, if the yogurt is white, you say it's white. If it's black, you just say it's black. It's like an Armenian saying. So it's like, if it is what it is, just say it. But we're afraid to saying it the way it is. And this actually, I'll share this without divulging any names, but recently I was having a correspondence with a very notable personality within the Buddhist world. He's also a monastic, very well known individual with authority and engaged in many different ways. And I explained the situation that I am witnessing here in Armenia with Artsakh, and how for over 30 days the civilians have been shelled, bombarded, and I know individuals by name with whom I am working right now as my patients now as a psychotherapist, working with them. I know what has been happening on the ground. And I shared with this venerable a very detailed correspondence, also providing for that individual several lists whereby they could go ahead and find out resources, whereby they could come up with their own conclusions. Not only did this person not do or even hit click on these links, which I had gone through the trouble of explaining and pointing out to him, providing for him rather, but he completely pushed it aside, bringing into focus other factors that were undeniably there and spoken about by every single news agency in the world, meaning coronavirus, for example, which no one argues. And I just, every letter, every square inch of that email that I was looking at, I was confronted by the toxic neutrality also. And I couldn't obviously even reply to that email because there was no need. It was very clear. The lack of position holding towards the immorality, the barbaric events that I've been taking, like recently, the maternity hospital that was bombed in this region. So how could I ignore that? As a human being, as a layperson, as a lay Buddhist, several years ago when the tsunami hit in Southeast Asia, in Sri Lanka, Thailand, India, so many countries were involved. Many of us actually jumped up into the occasion, and we pitched in. We went deep into our pockets. We did so much. Same thing when Nepal's earthquake took place. And only a few years ago, when the bombing happened in Sri Lanka, in churches, everybody I knew, and whoever didn't know, I did my part to go ahead and share these information. And I was so stunned and in a beautiful fashion of the humanity that I saw in people. And yet, these things are happening. So it's blatantly out there, the carelessness into looking at what is happening. And am I being selective because I'm far removed geographically from this region? And plus CNN and BBC are not talking about it, so obviously it's not important. When a fellow bhikkhu is pointing this out, putting in the crosshairs and putting it in front of my desk. So that's how I would approach trying to answer your question.
Yeah, okay, no, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, KK.
I want to ask you a question about moral, because sometimes it's really easy to tell what's a moral action. Like, of course, killing someone, taking one's life is immoral. But like, to go back to the question that Russell asked earlier, so the person who is doing the comment saying that, it's artistic freedom, right? So can we define moral as something that is not moral, as something that would cause either physical or mental harm to others? Mm-hmm. So that is, because that's, some people call things dubious moral. So I just wanted to say a little more about what you consider to be a human moral act in these kind of more nebulous areas. Like someone would say that, it's for art's sake. For art's sake, why should I be, But it is causing harm. So I definitely feel that the person, especially the term you mentioned, repeatability. Like the first time you can excuse him, yes, he was doing it innocently, but after the protests and so forth, and it's done again or it's promulgated again, then I do think that it's inconsiderate, but when you go so far as to say it's like not moral, something that is so inconsiderate.
With your permission, KK, I just wanted to clarify the part of the question for those of you here who weren't there in the beginning. The cartoon, it's about the cartoon that was done by the French artists, I believe, who depicted the Prophet Muhammad of the Islamic faith, and the creative liberties and the freedom that he had, and whether he was exercising any sense of morality, etc. And could there be such a thing when you're practicing artistic freedom, etc., which earlier Russell had asked. So this is in reference to that. It comes from individual responsibility, like we've talked about this many times. And years ago when I was studying art, painting and drawing at the Fine Arts Academy years ago in Lebanon, I would have colleagues, friends in the academy where they would just have very there's no no limitations as to how we should and would need to or feel like we could express. Anything is possible, anything is on the table. And they would tell me about stories of how some artists have even used the tail end of a cow, for example, to dip the hairy part of the cow's tail into a bucket full of paint and then use a canvas, a blank canvas behind the cow and allow the cow to wiggle and move its tail, and voila, you have an art piece. And many people were making exorbitant amounts of money with this. And other people have done some even more grotesque ways of using the brush themselves. Without using their hands, etc. Use your imagination here in creating pieces of art. Okay, so slowly we're pushing and pushing the boundaries as to what is acceptable, what is not, until we get to a point where anything is acceptable. Anything is acceptable. There was one artist in the 80s, I believe, early 80s in France, where a friend of mine at the academy had gone to, unfortunately, only the day after the opening night at the arts gallery. And to the best of my ability, from what he told me as to what he saw, he's looking around the gallery walls and he's only seeing blank walls. And then he asks the curator or the gallery owner, manager, and he says, "Where are the pieces?" And he says, "Do you see over there in the corner near the ceiling?" And he sees some scribbles, almost like a pencil drawing, writing, not even a drawing. And he gets on a ladder to see it closely, which they had installed specifically for that. And they said, "That's the art piece." And the artist apparently had gotten to a point where he doesn't even draw on anything. He just writes his name and a title name on the bottom of his business card, and that becomes the art piece. So what I'm saying is, I'm coming from a point of, less malignant way of using art, where ridiculousness is pushed beyond its boundaries. Now, when you are looking at the situation from the way that my work impacts the world around me, one needs to be at least a little bit more cognizant of the impact it will have on, let's say, these people. So if this person were to be a Muslim, this artist, probably, I don't know if this is true, but probably he might have been a little bit more cautious, or at least more aware of the connotations of his actions. Or at least, if he's about to draw this drawing, to go ahead and research as to what or how Islam holds, what is its position towards a person who, in their understanding and evaluation, violates the image of their prophet. I mean, this is the highest authority that they have in their religion. Now, Russell, I think you mentioned something about, I don't know how this would resonate with Buddhists, but I found pictures or statues of Buddha, for example, where he's smoking. There was one person, a Buddhist group, who had a statue where the Buddha is smoking, like finger and cigarette. I found that to be very distasteful, to say the least. But, I mean, no Buddhist I know will ever go and try to assassinate someone. But that is obviously not within the structure of the Dhamma. There is no use of the sword, right? But in Islam, it is. It is there. So, at the very least, even if they're not coming after this individual, the person, the artist, could this person's actions create situations where other people might get in the way and they become victims, as it happened in France? So again, I don't know of any authority or moral authority that could come and enforce that upon the artist. I would hope that the artist oneself stops and reconsiders, at least for the grander, scope of things that would ensue because of this, the vibration, the ripple effect of his one particular action. Meanwhile, he's become very famous, obviously. Now we're talking about him for the past, X amount of minutes. So, and that's a wonderful way to boost one's ego as well. I don't know if that was his intention, but hey, we're people, unless he's awakened. So I don't have a concrete answer other than the individual's responsibility towards one's actions. It's not just a matter of art, of course. Anything. Like this one Buddhist teacher or individual scholar that I mentioned. we each of us have to have this sense of responsibility and, yes, moral obligation. I used to try to exercise this as a science teacher in high school when I was about to be saying something, and then I would consider that it was a parochial school. It was a Christian school. Yes, I had told specifically, it was in my contract, where no one was going to inhibit my description and explanation and evaluation of evolution. And I was going to explain it as a biology teacher. So I wasn't going to hear any headache. I wasn't going to have headaches. And they said, yes, you're fine. So, but I still, no one would come after me, but still I would have to use some fine-tuning and some subtleties and nuances of engagement so that I don't insult or assault this child's or their parents' necessarily faith or beliefs, without compromising what I was teaching, of course. So the subtlety, I mean, we can be blunt, or we can be a little bit more careful and respectful. I guess that's something that I would add. I don't know if my answer is making sense. Yes? Russell has a question.
Yeah, maybe just to extend what the KK and our discussion on this, maybe the factor that people should have to realize, I think, which is sort of Buddhist, is the sort of interdependence, the linking quality of various phenomena. So both for the artists who create these caricature and also the the violent killers, I mean, maybe neither kind of recognize the consequences and the interdependence of their actions, outside of themselves as individuals, or their kind of position, whether it's on religion or art, or cultural freedom. But I think from my superficial, understanding of the Buddhism, is that interdependence and this sort of causation, these kind of, make you think twice before committing the brush to the paper or the, sword to the head. I mean, they're kind of different, but in a way, maybe there is some kind of equivalence, especially if it's done without certain kind of wisdom.
Yeah, I would have loved to have a little bit more, have had on part of the media, etc., more coverage of the lady who, I think it was a lady who was beheaded in the church, which sends several messages, by the way. See, sometimes in the West, we don't consider so many of the nuances that exist within people who don't or have not been raised within Western cultures. And there's a certain lack in our understanding in the West as a collective of appreciation, not in a good way appreciation, but understanding as to what these underlying factors are and what is being said. Here's a church which is representative of Christendom, the West, Western civilization, and here's the sword. And the person has yelled Allahu Akbar, which is God is great, which is what the call to jihad is, basically. And a Christian person is sitting there praying, and he is decapitating her. None of these factors I've seen. Perhaps I haven't looked in the right places, maybe it's my fault, but none of it I've seen receiving enough attention. And we are placing the caricature and the act, which we talked about quite extensively, here at least, and the act, the savagery, which was actually the second within a few days. And the lack in the government's moral standing to establish a firm ground. Now, I mentioned earlier about the Buddha's understanding, appreciation of the king's role. The king was the ruler of the land. The Buddha never interfered with that. And because of the rulership of the king to establish the rule of law, discipline, and safety, we had the Dhamma grow. Otherwise, you would have had many bhikkhus being decapitated left and right. Now, unfortunately, in the West, that has been completely wiped out. It's an open door policy, and we don't want to offend anyone in any way, any shape. Coming back to the earlier position holding of, you know what, let me have hold a position, despite what that might bring to me, how many bots or how many people will troll me online. Unfortunately, my heart goes out. My heart goes out to this unfortunate situation, the victim of it, this woman, and the other individuals who were also killed. So I think we lack the fortitude to stand up and say things as the way they need to be said. These people need to be punished, and they need to be dealt with properly, legally, with certain punitive responses, consequences. But unfortunately, there isn't that, and it's coming out of our Western civilization. And that is like leaving the door open for the wolves to come in, and good luck. And I invite people to, once airports are open and flights are possible, to go and see this for oneself. There's parts of Germany and I think Sweden, also Sweden out of all places, where police officers do not dare to go in these neighborhoods. They're afraid. So these are realities that no one is speaking about. So the person did a horrendous act which needs to be punished severely. And yes, the artist needs to be held accountable on some level of exercise, needs to exercise some sense of decorum consideration. I don't know if they did that towards, I don't know, Christ or a major Jewish rabbi, for example. How would that resonate with us? Would we latch on a certain label on them and go after them and completely discredit them? Possibly, I don't know. So, but I saw your hand come up, Dhammadina. Yes?
Thank you, Bhante. I wanted to comment on what we have been speaking so far in terms of, the Dhamma, the practice, sila, precepts. We talk about 5 precepts as a way to, like you were mentioning some weeks ago, to protect the boundaries of our minds. To really choose what goes into the 6 sense doors and what we say no to. And, bringing back the individual responsibility again and again. Excuse me. However, I think we can all agree that today in the world, globally, we see a movement that seems to be attacking individualism itself, individual responsibility. We talk about collectivities, the East and the West, men, women, Western, Eastern, and I've seen this in the context of feminism, for example, in terms of some of us using the past to justify the present. Let's say when a woman mistreats a man, you will be surprised, but I even not too long ago had a university professor who, in the classroom, she said that, men have been oppressing women for a long time. Now it's our turn. As if tit for tat, revenge kind of freedom. Let's give women the freedom to do the same, basically, to men. So that perverse version of feminism, if I may put it that way. So I see that tendency to use the past to justify the present, where we don't talk about individual responsibility and the actual behavior gets to be ignored. Say how this woman spoke to this man, or how she treated him, or how this, race treated the other race, while we may use the past and say, oh, they were oppressed, now they are rightfully returning what is what the other person deserves. So I, again, to me at least, this again and again really highlights the value of the precepts of individual responsibility. And the sense that you are really going against the current. And I can see how many people today are fearful of saying how they really feel because they are under the heavy load of these concepts, historical analysis and etc., yet the behavior gets to be ignored. So I think you mentioned many times about this therapeutic phrase that we have, trust the behavior, not the words. And I personally try to really use the Dhamma to see the behavior in the present, because I also see that tendency of the past coming into my mind and saying, but this thing happened, but maybe it excuses the deed. But no, I mean, we cannot fail to see the act in the present moment and name it as it is now, and discern between the act and rationalizations, justifications, excuses, etc. So, as far as our practice, it, again, to me at least, brings me back to the 5 precepts as a very powerful and practical training in morality. And I will not be afraid to use that word, which I also see being viewed as backwards, you old school, taboo even. So just wanted to kind of share that experience from the feminist experiences that I have had very recently at the university that I go.
Thank you for that very personal and again poignant way of expressing something that is often unspoken but felt nevertheless. And also it takes courage to say it out loud these days. And yes, there is that hush-hushness in today's society. People are afraid. I've seen grown men and women avoiding saying things that need to be said. And then when the doors are closed and there aren't that many people around in the group, let's say, and they've known you for some time, they'll feel a little bit okay to say a few words just to test the water. And then when they hear that it's being resonated back, and they'll go, you see this miraculous relaxation on their face, this big smile, and you see now they're being authentic, and they come out not being racist or sexist or anything. And do share with me. I've had women who've said that to me. I've had men, obviously, who've said that they can't speak about anything without being afraid that they're going to get in trouble. And this is happening in the 21st century. So, yes.
So, on that point about not being able to speak, I came to the USA from Australia when I was around 40 years of age. So, coming to a new country, I obviously hadn't had the education that you get in the country to learn some history and to learn what's right and wrong from the US point of view. So and I got the education that you get in Australia, which is substantially different to the education that you get in the US. So I found I was in a situation where there were a lot of things that I couldn't talk about because I had the experience of getting reactions totally out of proportion to what it was I was trying to say. And to use an example, in Australia, we don't have I guess we have a racist problem, or they have a racist problem since I'm not there anymore. But it was different to the struggle that's been in the USA for the last 60 years or more. It goes back a lot more than 60 years, but the changes have occurred more in that time. So And I hadn't experienced that history of those changes and to learn the things that are right and wrong. So when I came to America, my understanding was you would never call a person of colour black. To me, that would be horror. If someone had said that, I'd go, whoop. But when I come here, and the words that I would have used to describe those person, it's the opposite. My wife's telling me, don't use those words. So it was a real struggle for me, and I'm still very aware when I'm speaking to an American person that my attitudes and understandings are not the same as theirs. And as I said before, sometimes I'm speaking even after I've been here 20 years now, and I've learned what you learn in 20 years, so that I'm now much more comfortable, but I still see reactions in people to something that I've just said out of all proportion to what I think I'm saying. So whilst it's not true for the cartoonist, because I believe a cartoonist portraying Muhammad in a cartoon implies that he knows a little bit about the story and about what he's doing, so he should have some more respect, any respect, and understanding of the results of his actions. But just how easy it is to insult people, how easy it is to cause upset to people, it really means that we need to bear that in mind and in our own practice to work on ourselves and to not be upset by things that we see out in the world, to understand how easy it is, and when people do things that are upsetting, especially to us, that in most cases they probably don't mean it. And there's nothing to get upset about. It's just to understand the issue. So, as a white male, I guess I've probably had a much easier life. I can see that than many, many other people in the world. And living in Australia was a very nice place to be born and to grow up. And now I live in the USA in a fairly comfortable situation, so I'm not experiencing many problems and the stress and strife in the world that's going on. But my unique experience of having not come here and simply being in an area that's completely different gives me some insight into how easy it is to upset other people and to cause stress. That isn't my fault, because I don't even have the intention to do that.
Yes. I really appreciate each of your personal experiences that you're sharing here, because it makes it richer, much richer experience, and especially for those individuals who later listen to this audio. When we hold ourselves back from saying and expressing ourselves in a truthful and respectful and honest manner, it has to find other means, other ways of outlet. I was mentioning this to someone recently about expressing sadness. A person who lost her brother, whom she loved very much, and then less than 2 days later she lost her uncle to a drone attack. And she was stunned. She didn't know what to do, and she's obviously at this point in her phase of grief. There's this denial. So the mind wants to concoct these pseudo-realities. But it will go in underground. That energy will have to find an outlet. Somehow it needs to come out. Now, I'm expressing an extreme example here compared to holding oneself back from saying certain words, obviously. But nevertheless, the lack of possibility, for whatever reason, to come out and express it the way it needs to be said in a safe, comfortable, respectful manner, that is becoming more and more of a rarity in our society. And that is sad. Well, why should one person not be able to speak without the other person feeling, well, you just offended me? Well, why? Wait a minute, ask me, have I? Like, have you seen me offend you or offend anyone before, but it's just my mere usage of a certain word, which, by the way, is very temporal. Tomorrow it might become a trend to use that word. And meanwhile, there is more of a gap, a ridge being created between people. In fact, between ourselves and our experience of reality. So we are creating these pseudo-realities, these ideals that have nothing to do with what's happening. But people are hurting. Even when someone is, I've had one time a supervisor, a female supervisor, and we were talking about sexism and all that. And I gave several examples of how certain women that I've come across in my work as a psychotherapist were flat out sexist. And I gave all the 360 information whereby she could go ahead and also get more privy to what was ensued in those scenarios, circumstances. And she listened, she smiled. She hid her smile a few times. One time she giggled. And then she said, you have to understand, you, meaning I, being a man, were in control, coming back to your point, Dhammadina, earlier. You were on the opposite side of the pendulum. You were in control for so many hundreds, if not thousands of years. So now it is our turn, she said. She says those words. And I said, so what have we learned? Why has there been this feminist, beautiful movement, the initial one, necessary one? What were you guys fighting against? By the way, you've become the very enemy that you've despised. And now you're standing there, a very educated, a woman with a doctorate, sitting there justifying the inhumanity in this behavior. She excused herself because she had an appointment that suddenly arose out of thin air. So, these are things that happen. And are happening, but we are refusing to talk about them because what is accepted and what is not accepted. And it does not need to be so. So long as we are behaving in a civilized, respectful manner and fully, to the best of our abilities, are able to express our intentions behind the words. And if we do make a mistake, we come out and not sugarcoat it, but just say it. I'm sorry I said to you this word, which now I understand that I might have hurt you, and I perhaps I did hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. End of story. But we like to latch on. In the Dhamma we have adana, patinisagga. But upadana comes in between. Russell, you were saying about the interdependency of things, and I will just bring in the example from the Paticca Samuppada, the 12 links of causal relations. A huge part of the Dhamma, by the way. Upadana is the clinging aspect, which perpetuates existence. At least the existence or the experience of the thing that happened back there in the past. The idea of personality or atta, all these things stem from that clinging to an image, an experience that took place in the past. So we hold on to that experience, wanting it to either continue or extract some sense of satisfaction from it or due to it, including anger-causing sensations. Because it gives us this fake sense of being in control when one is angry, but that's a different topic altogether. But anyhow, adana patinisagga. Adana means picking up. Patinisagga means give up. I've used the example of sandbags. When there's a flood going on, people stand in line in unison and work together as a community, as individuals, but as a group to help support the stoppage, the blocking of the flood waters. And they use sandbags, but nobody is going to hold the sandbag like this. But we have become sandbag holders, clingers to sandbags. Instead of seeing what's happening, here is a person who's hurting because of what he or she experienced. I'm not going to explain that away. This is real. By bringing my own stories, my own chip on the shoulder situation. But that requires tremendous amount of honesty and courage and truthfulness, which unfortunately is lacking in today's culture. People are going to get education so that they can become more professional in their rhetoric, in how they could outbeat the other person. So, in that sense, these are dangerous times. So, the honesty, the fortitude of being able to at least hold oneself responsible to expressing one's own state, thoughts, feelings, so long as they are not intended to be spoken or even thought about in terms of that the Buddha would call dosa or aversion. Is there some humanity? How about compassion? That, to me, is the truest sense of compassion. Engaged Buddhist compassion. And not some word or even a thought that we can send. It's a feeling. It's an experiential manifestation of oneself. It's an extension of one's very being, which needs to be honest. In that sense, again, the Dhamma becomes alive, part and parcel of your life, where sati and sampajanya are always there. A person who has sati and wisdom, with every interaction, they're very cognizant of what would happen after the interaction. Meaning, will there be any kukucha or remorse? A sense of regret. And when we are not being honest with ourselves, at least, and being truthful in expressing ourselves, guess what will happen? Despite the fact that you had sati, despite the fact that you had clear understanding, the insight, but you did not have the courage to say it, we're going to have to pay for it later on to ourselves, because now there is regret, which will inevitably, sooner or later, create this shaky state, agitated state in the mind. And Nibbana is a state where there is absolutely no agitation. No agitation, Nibbana. The Buddha says so in countless different ways. So the first responsibility always behooves upon us, towards ourselves. Which takes guts, but it cuts clean. One of the paramis or perfections that the Buddha had to overcome, one of the 10, involves satya or truthfulness. Truthfulness also is very courageous. Standing your ground, so long as you know you're not taking anything away from anyone, but you are living your truth of experience. And now we are living ideals that are not even truths, let alone our truths. We use lofty terms like liberty, freedom, this, that. All have become nonsensical because they've become divorced from the reality of experience of oneself, of these truths for oneself. Freedom can be taken away easily. So I know we went over, but these are very important topics, and I really, really, really appreciate your sharing abundantly, generously here with your own experience and thoughts, and your courage. Yes. I can take one more short question if you have it. Otherwise, we can share the merits. But if there's any really urgent question, of course, you always have the option of emailing me. All right, in that case. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find health relief. May all beings share in these merits that we have thus acquired, for the achievement and accomplishment of all kinds of wholesome happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share in these merits. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you for being here. May your smiles never leave your faces and your hearts. May the Triple Gem bless you constantly, whether you're mindful or not. Hopefully mindful. Be well.